and this is the Design Criticism MFA department. We have a few remaining fall lectures, which you're most welcome to attend. Tonight we have the glorious Emilie Baltz, Why Foreplay Makes the Food. Next week we'll have Steve Amond, How to Make the Reader See It. The book is a visual artifact. And then on the 4th of December, Murray Moss, Apples to Oranges, Dialogues Between Art and Design in Commerce and Culture. For those of you who've missed past lectures, they are fully on, there are 141 videos on our Decrit Vimeo page. So please, it's kind of like a TED Talk kind of thing. So go and check out those things on the website. Oh, by the way, I am not the program director. Alice Twemlow could not be here tonight. She's the person who usually introduces everything, but she's asked me to pinch it for her tonight. We're very proud to announce that we just had a brochure printed about the exploits of graduates of the program. So for those of you who are interested in why somebody comes to a program such as ours and what the hell they do after they leave, there are actually copies of this out where we're going to have the reception afterwards. And we hope that you all come to have some cocktails and snacks and conversations afterwards. Basically, it gives a sense of what brought them to Decrit and what they learned here and what they went on to do. And as some examples, here is Barbara Eldritch, who before coming to Decrit was a theatrical lighting designer, but actually found that her passion was design criticism. And she had an incredibly interesting thesis that asked why there were no guns in the MoMA design collection, which she wrote a really fantastic thesis. And ironically ended up getting a job there working with Paola Antonelli, who was somebody who had spoken about the reasons why she thought they didn't have any in the collection. We also, from our first graduating class in 2010, we have Fred Duarte from Lisbon, who found out about the program actually before we even did and demanded to be a part of it. He's now back in Lisbon running events, curating exhibitions, writing for a host of international publications, and basically helping to reshape the global design conversation. And I'm actually not kidding. He is an incredible, indefatigable force for design advocacy, and a really wonderful guy. Finally, we have Amelie, who was already an accomplished journalist in Vienna when she entered the program. But she actually had a dream of becoming a design curator. And 2 months after graduating, she was offered a position as curator at the Vitra Design Museum in Germany, which was really a dream come true for her. But those are just a few of the stories that we have from our graduates. And again, the brochure will be in the reception area, and we'd love you to take it. But on to tonight's show. This lecture series is a place where we get to hear from people outside of the program who bring, for our delight and edification, new ideas and working methods from other disciplines, other worlds. And tonight's special guest is actually someone that I introduced to the program because a special emphasis of the program is on expanding the range of media by which we might reach our audience. And in terms of providing inspiration for experimentation with media, there's no one better that I know of than Emilie Baltz. And Emilie Baltz, otherwise known as Baltz to me, is also a very dear friend and a hell of a dancer if you ever have the pleasure. But on a more professional level, she works at the very curious intersection of food, sex, and design, creating work that provokes our relationship to eating, drinking, and I'm not going to say the word that Alice put in there because my mother would blush, but you know, screwing around through imagery, products, books, and experiences. Her incredibly wide variety of clients include eBay, the Museum of Sex, Droog Design, the New York Parks Department, the Vitra Design Museum, and Good Magazine. She serves as faculty in SVA's Products of Design MFA, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that, and is a visiting lecturer at l'ESSAD in Reims, France. Please welcome Emilie Baltz.
Thank you, that was glowing, and Andrea's equally an amazing dancer, if you didn't know that. Good shot. We both decided that after this, we're forming our own modern dance troupe, right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much for having me. As said, I'm going to I made up this title so you would all come, by the way, right? I'm not talking about sex in here at all. What I do want to talk to you tonight is about what experience means within desire. And this is me. So this is me smashed against a plate. I'm half French and half American, and for all of my life, I've been colliding between cultures, between cities. I grew up outside of Chicago in Joliet, Illinois, and my mom comes from northern France, so we would go back and forth between the Midwest and northern France, basically between this and this. And as I grew up, I started realizing that this shifting cultural identity was also part of my shifting personal identity. And the biggest difference that I found as I went between cities, cultures, families, was the way in which people either gathered around tables or did not gather around tables, whether they used silver forks and knives or plastic cutlery, whether we sat down with china or paper plates. These are generalizations, but it was something that started to make me think about the role of food in culture and the role of food in behaviors. And it really made me see what the implications of eating were, because in each of these cultural experiences that I was having, food seemed to me our most fundamental form of consumption. So how people were eating also seemed to be how they were consuming cars, clothes, friendships, jobs, etc. So that is something that I hold dear as one of my personal tenets. And that has sort of affected my work since then. Because we can all look at this image, right? And we can see that this is an oyster. But why, when we say the word oyster, do we think of something like this, the image on the left? Well, it's because of a host of things, right? So oysters are deemed aphrodisiac. They're deemed items of luxury and desire. But it actually, if you look at its chemical properties as a singular ingredient, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. The only thing that is slightly aphrodisiac in an oyster is the amount of zinc, and you'd have to eat like 9 bushels of it to have anything happen. So how do we start creating these feelings and these emotions? Well, it's the space in between. It's that little equals sign, right? It's everything that surrounds an ingredient, just like everything that surrounded the eating experiences I was having growing up. And that's what I start to think of when I look at work like this, right? We have Georgia O'Keeffe borrowing with these same metaphors. We have this advertisement for mayonnaise, which somehow uses a carrot, because mayonnaise and carrots go beautifully together. But what those two things pick up on is something that this also does. The oyster is sort of this perfect example of what I think of as foreplay in food, because it kind of captures a lot of things in our life. It taps upon the fact that it looks like female genitalia. It actually sort of smells like it. It feels like it, and it might even sound like it. Right? So it's this really robust experience design in a singular ingredient. And that's when I started thinking about food in this way. So it had nothing to do with the oyster. It had everything to do with all of these things that surround the oyster. And those for me become the foreplay of eating, the foreplay of consumption. And we as humans, we make all these things. We make up ideology, we make art, we make religion, we make gestures. We are implicated in activating our senses. And as a designer, these are all things that I'm interested in. Because at base, what I'm fascinated by is why people do what they do. And when people do things, they create traditions, they create behaviors, and then they create culture. So I started looking at this. I said, well, what is the most fundamental, basic thing I can do to affect culture? Simply put, food and sex. That's what keeps people alive, right? Any sort of behavior, right, is a manifestation of what goes on between our ears. And these are things that are interesting to me, these low-level behaviors that are universal, that are shared across individuals, across cultures, across cities, across potentially institutions. And food, sex, and drink, we'll pull that in there, are essential for our survival. So this is a place that I was naturally drawn to, but it didn't happen as easily as this. And I think I choose this image because to me it becomes emblematic of all of it, right? We create cultural icons, we create emotion, we create desire through this thing that we call food. And we do that through something I think I call desire. Now, to give you an example of how I've gotten here, I'll give you a brief history of my path. As Andrea said, I am a good dancer because I did used to dance. I studied Martha Graham and film studies in undergraduate. I actually majored in screenwriting. So immediately I was affected by these kind of physical narratives. And when I left school, I did nothing with that. No, I became a photographer. And I cocktail waitressed and met all of these chefs and started taking photographs of their dishes. And I loved it. But it was something that was very, very personal. It was for me, and it created distance between me and other. I was always looking. I wasn't really engaging. I wasn't making experiences. I was in 2 dimensions. So I got tired of that, and I wanted to make things for you instead, so I could be with all of you. And I went back to school, and I went to Pratt, and I got a master's degree in industrial design, and I made all of this. Everything from electronics to jewelry for baccarat to a baby stroller, ping pong tables. I even made crap for Walmart. I totally admit it. And I made a lot of stuff, and I learned a lot of industrial techniques. I learned about brand strategy. I learned about all sorts of things that this world of design was made of. And in the middle of it, I lost myself. So I started thinking about how I could be with you in an us. And that is what led me to this thing that I call the 4th dimension, which I think of as food. You know, and I start my presentation with that, but it is these fundamental behaviors that are interesting to me. And since the dawn of mankind, we have used food experiences to sit down, to tell stories to each other. And through those stories, we create new mythologies, and we therefore create new communities and new cultures. So now I'd like to take you through an evolution of that progression. And I'm calling them acts of feeding. And you'll see it's an exploration of my interventions, both ways of feeding myself and being able to feed others, in this multifaceted world that actually comprises food and the design of the food experience. So I start with this always, and this is actually the thing that I started with. I made this shift from being a classic industrial designer and realizing I could no longer do this because I was losing my soul. So I molded my boob in Jell-O. This is a life cast of my left breast, and it's made of hand-squeezed peach juice, hand-squeezed watermelon juice, and the inside is a lapsang souchong panna cotta. And if you know what lapsang souchong is, it's this sort of like smoky, dirty tea. So you cut through it and you have this, ooh, what am I eating? Yes, and dirty is a play on words, of course. And it was part of a Jell-O competition, and people came and they ate me. So it was my way of literally putting myself out there, using myself as an ingredient and saying, this is the time to start this new form of consumption. Evolving from that, started thinking of what else can I reflect on? And as I said, I grew up in the Midwest, and there was a lot of this around me growing up. Like, I wasn't allowed to use it. I really loved it, though. Mousse, soft shimmer body cream, these things that could like make your hair in amazing places and your skin glow so beautifully, right? These are objects of desire. They help us become beautiful for others. They are designed that way. They are the foreplay to many, many, many things that will evolve after that. So I then looked at this. Yeah, the shapes of the bottles are the same, sort of, but did you know that the ingredients are also the same? Like, there are the same emulsifiers in Easy Cheese as they are in hair mousse, and the same emulsifiers in Jergens as there is in Royal Blue decorative icing. Like, it's absolutely vile, and yet we call this food, right? So I made a series of self-portraits that were commentaries on this, and I made a Cheese Whiz necklace and a blue tribal frosting collar, and then homage to my old aunt, I made this sort of like 50s Cheese Whiz green frosting collar thing. And each of this series had a decomposition of the object in which it started to melt and I ate it. So revealing the fact that this was, in a sense, the costume jewelry of food, and posing the question culturally, why do we accept to put this in our mouth? As a further reflection onto myself and this place and culture, I grew up in a picture framing shop. My dad was a picture framer for many years when I was born. And he used to gild picture frames. So I grew up around all of these traditions, and he gilded in a very ancient way, I guess, is water gilding. So it's actually the early techniques that were used for gilding frames. And that means there's no substrate put over the wood. You water gild, adhesive gold directly on wood. The interesting thing is that he was doing this in Joliet, Illinois, and he was married to a French woman. So it was sort of an old world craft in a new world setting. And as I started to reflect on my own interest in food and trying to bring my work to a larger dimension, I've always been really interested in furniture. I wanted to be a furniture designer for a little while too. And in thinking about the American experience, I started to think about, well, what are these icons of American eating? And one of them that comes to mind for me is the picnic table. It's this object that exists in public space. You jump on it, you bounce on it, you roll on it, you make forts out of it, and then you sit down and you eat on it. It's a fascinating object to me. So as commentary, I decided that I would put myself into this, and so I designed a picnic table and had it made by the Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So bringing New World fundamental craft, and then I covered it in 900 leaves of 24-karat gold using this technique that I had learned from my father. And so this is, as I know it, the only existing gilt picnic table in the world. And it ended up as part of a show at Max Lane Gallery a few years ago called Material Culture, Contemporary American Design. And it became one more nod to this fact that I wanted to insert myself into the world, kind of another point of entry into some commentary for me. And then I made these as accessories. This is a gilt hamburger and a gilt Twinkie. So going beyond myself within this process has also now been an understanding of wanting to feed others through this process. And I think one of the easiest things that we do is share stories when we sit down at tables together. And I wanted to find a way to be able to capture those stories. So I made this. It was the food bank, and it's a mobile recording booth in which you go in, you press a button, and I asked everyone to record their favorite American food memory in a way to be able to literally give a voice to food, and then capturing this information to create a virtual cookbook in which you would not search by ingredient, but you would search by event, location, or emotion. And what happened is that people went in there and talked for hours, it seemed like. They just wanted to share a piece of themselves, a piece of their history. And what came out of it was a topography of really beautiful, really nuanced, and actually very eclectic mythologies that came from America. Thinking on this, I thought, well, what could be ways to actually insert that more into consumer culture? And as I said, I grew up half French and half American, and these were things we were not allowed to eat, right? And they were objects of desire for me. Why? Because they were filled with these amazing cartoons, and there are no Twinkies here, and sadly there are no Twinkies anywhere anymore, but things that would fly into space and make me dream about other worlds. So thinking about listening to people's memories, I was hearing a lot about junk food, a lot about preparations. So I thought, well, what would be my memory of that? And so I developed this project called Junk Foodie, 51 delicious recipes for the Lowbrow Gourmand, in which I go through a series of breakfast, lunches, dinners, amuse-bouche, desserts, and cocktails. And what I did is I took all these gastronomic recipes that I grew up with and remade them only using American junk food. So it really was, as a design project, a material, texture, and color process. So I would go through grocery stores and look for things that had certain crunches to them, certain colors to them, certain flavor profiles to them, and then reconstruct all sorts of things like the moelleux au chocolat, which is a chocolate cupcake stuffed with Hershey's Kisses, and my favorite, the Twinkie Napoleon. So if you know what a Napoleon is, it's this French pastry that's all puff pastry and pastry cream. So it has this crunchy, squishy, kind of sweet, savory consistency to it. And amazingly enough, you can make it by using Twinkies and potato chips. Because little did you know, or maybe you do know, that if you take the Twinkie cake and you squish it, it actually reconstitutes immediately back into dough. That's the amount of stabilizers that are in there. So this lent itself very easily to making dough and rolling it out like you would a pâte feuilletée, and then reserving the cream and adding the cream back in, smashing up potato chips, layering them on top, repeating. And literally what you put in your mouth is something that uncannily tastes and feels like a Napoleon. It was unbelievable. So this process led me into many other things, like a jelly belly clafoutis. The jelly belly is like the bouillon cube of junk food. It's amazing. It has like all these tropical flavors and sort of savors and sensations you can't get anywhere else. This is a circus peanut aron, my take on a macaron, made with circus peanuts, the insides of a Mounds bar, and fun dip. So what happened through this book is that people would look at it, and I swear to you that most of my colleagues in the Midwest think it's amazing, and they buy it for their children, and they make the recipes because these are favorite foods. And then most of my colleagues around me here look at it and laugh hysterically when you see this. Whoops. When you start to look at this and you start to look at this. And I think that, for me, is the interesting part of posing these questions, is that we look at this image, and this is all my photography and design, and I consciously make it so you desire it, right? So you want it, so your mouth sort of drools. And then we look at the bagged, packaged, fabricated food and start to pose ourselves the same questions. Well, what is food? Why do we desire things? What makes us drool, and what makes us not drool? So the circle expanded to want to make more live experiences, and this is a project that I worked on last year. It's something that was called What Happens When, and it was a temporary restaurant installation. And one of the facets that I think is interesting to explore with food is the way that it can create community. And through that community, you create engagement, you create new relationships, and potentially even new flavors, new languages, etc. So What Happens When was a test project. It was basically a giant design charrette in which we took over an abandoned restaurant in Soho, got a lease for 9 months, and decided to do a project that would transform every 30 days. We would transform the interiors, we would transform the menu, and we would transform the soundtrack. And what would that do? How would these elements start to work together? How would they not start to work together? So it became a kind of a test kitchen. And this is the branding that I came up with. It's a series of 9 symbols, and each of these symbols was attached to what we called a movement, one of those 30 days. And the goal was to be able to create, like I said, a set of flavors, sounds, designs, colors, textures that would start to be attached to this iconography. And we raised money through Kickstarter. And not only raising money for it, we actually asked everyone from the community to donate an idea for one of the themes for one of the movements of the restaurant. So it really became a cyclical community project in which not only people were backing it fiscally, but they were also contributing to it creatively, and then they could come and eat in it and see the result of their work. So this is the space. It was on Cleveland Place, just in Soho. And the first month was ours, and so we laid the groundwork for it. And the design of it was basically a black box, and we hung 400 hooks across the ceiling. And that allowed all of our lights to be able to move and change, and different elements to be hung within the space. And we very literally invited everyone into our drawings. And so the floor is the seating plan, the walls are the elevation, the ceiling is a reflected ceiling plan. The food, that movement was ingredient driven, like very fresh flavors, sort of Scandinavian inspired. The second month was a suggestion to do something of around a childhood forest, so a fantasy space. So we took this sort of, I call this the Burning Man curtain, but these giant blue teal blue sticks and created an abstract forest that went all across the ceiling, interspersed with different vignettes, sort of these magical little forest vignettes. There are animal tracks across the floor. So the idea was to start to create these environments that would then support the food. And the food for that movement was deep, it was rich, it was a lot of wild game, it was a lot of really sort of velvety textures. After that, Renoir's boat party came up. So we made it. The inside was transformed with a giant awning, and it sort of became this picnic atmosphere. And it was amazing to see the way that people would change, the way the sound quality would change within the space, to see the way that people started acting differently. This was a much lighter experience, and so the food was classically French, but a little deconstructed, very bright flavors. And then we kind of came back home, and we were inspired by jazz. And we thought a long time about jazz. Well, what actually would that be? What would be an interesting way to explore it dimensionally and in terms of flavors? And we looked to rhythm. And so the space became tied. These are like those drawings that we used to do in kindergarten. The whole space became tied through with this rhythmic line work. There were these large instruments, sort of abstract instrument shapes that were the lighting fixtures. And the food was classically American. So big steaks, double-baked potatoes, creamed spinach. And the atmosphere became denser. It became a little more luscious. And then this happened. We lost our liquor license. The dramatic point of the story. Sadly, community boards were angry for a host of reasons, none of which had anything to do with us. But we made this instead. So we used design to create some commentary around it. We made a prohibition campaign. We stayed open for another month without liquor, and that was no fun at all, and we didn't make any money, so we closed our doors. But we had actually prepared the next movement, which was this symbol, which was to be inspired by the Spice Road. And no one ever saw this, but I wanted to share it with you. So this was to be the final movement. One piece in there that I touched on was this idea of language and how language starts to create culture. And I think within food, we obviously have words and recipes assigned to it. But something that I think food does is it is this universal language, and it brings us together and allows us to communicate in ways that don't have anything to do with vocabulary. So I did a project that was looking at food through the lens of color, but specifically cocktails. And I did this with Droog Design a few years ago. It was called CMYK Cocktails. And the idea was that I really wanted to know what cyan, yellow, magenta, and black tasted like in a drink. It just stuck in my brain. And so I designed this event that brought together 4 mixologists. Each one of them interpreted this color, the graphic design printing standards, through drink, and then brought together 4 designers, and each of them gave a short presentation on what that color meant to them in the world. And what happened is that, I quote, lifelong friends were made. Who knew? But I have testaments from many people. And all of these new flavors and all of this sort of new language, a synesthesia project basically, came out of it. We even took pictures. This is Seymour Quast saying CMYK, and my friend Emilie. So a diversity of new content and of new food languages came out of it, which is similar. I recently did this project actually in the Products of Design department for Rob Walker's new book, Significant Objects. And if you're familiar with that project, they put objects up. He and Joshua Glenn put objects up on eBay. And they instead of really assigning location to them or provenance, they wrote stories about them. And the objects ended up selling for something like triple to quadruple their actual price. And this was an interesting thing to me because it shows the power of narrative in consumption. And so when he did a book party, they came to me, and it was sponsored by eBay. Obviously, they were implicated in this whole project. And they said, well, what can we do? And so I came up with this idea called Significant Cocktails, in which 3 mixologists were invited to interpret 3 new significant objects. And those were a little gun necklace, interpreted by Martine Smith Matheson. And this cocktail is gin, Earl Grey tapioca, citrus, lime, and a little bit of hot buttered rum. And his reasoning for this is very interesting. So the shape of the necklace is interpreted through the tapioca. We kind of start to have shape semblance in our mouth. The gin, for him, was a metallic taste. The citrus adds a little bit to that. And then I said, well, where does the not hot butter rum, sorry, just hot butter. Where does hot butter come from? He said, well, this is an object that you would get out of a kid's vending machine. And what do kids have? Sticky, buttery fingers. So for him, it was a way to add another level of narrative to it. Kind of all these acts, all of these suggestions that would come before the actual ingestion. This was Lynette Marrero, who interpreted these two toy cars as a raspberry shrub, which is raspberry and vinegar, kind of taking from the color and then taking from the rust on the car and equaling that into an acidic profile. And last was Michael Serino, who runs something called a Razor and Shiny Knife. It's a supper club. And when he told me what he wanted to do, I was a little distraught because he said, oh, he got this. This is Eisenhower, by the way. It's a bottle stopper. And he said, I'm going to make a Long Island iced tea. Really? Oh, that's not very inventive. And then he sent me a 3-page story about what the Long Island iced tea was. And it had everything to do with his old uncle who had grown up in Long Island and basically ended up going after a whirlwind adventure to the hospital and getting lockjaw. And that's what he thought this bottle stopper was. So it was a way of starting to illustrate different points of entry, different points of interpretation, different points of creativity into the food experience. And here are some images. One of your fearless leader, Alice. Another way that I think about food in relationship to the world and to feeding others and feeding myself is through ecosystems. So we're obviously in a time of environmental peril. And I wanted to be able to engage ecologically in some way. And I worked with this woman, Natalie Jeremijenko, who's a biologist and an artist. And we came up with this series of dinners called the Cross Species Adventure Club, in which we would take one ingredient that could help bioremediate a certain part of a city and use molecular gastronomy to create delightful experiences for humans with that ingredient. So that meant that in a sense we were creating a demand for this ingredient that could hopefully then remediate a part of nature. And I was engaged to help with the design and the programming, and something that we brought into each of these dinners was that there was a workshop where you would learn how to develop these techniques around this ingredient. I made edible menus and these little bowls that you see on the left-hand side, which are actually dust masks. So every time you put them up, you have this symbolism of protection, of fear. So they were all props. They were all little pieces that started to help tell this story in slightly symbolic and interactive ways. Coming back down to earth from there is a project that I did with 34th Street Partnership. And 34th Street Partnership came to me and they said they're in charge of the business, they're the business improvement district for 34th Street down to Chelsea. And one of their missions is to beautify public space. So they make a lot of street furniture, kiosks, etc. Something that they are having an incredible problem with is food carts. They park in front of stores, they're on sidewalks, they smell, they are eyesores. And so they wanted to be able to find some way to help beautify that space. So they came to me with this project of how can we help understand the food cart landscape. And so for 2 months, I walked around 34th Street Partnership, and I met every single food vendor in the area. And I learned about them, I learned about where they parked, I learned about how they got food dropped to them, how they sold food, how they cleaned their food carts. And it became a project that, yes, was about food, but was actually much more about building relationships. It started to be about knowing who to talk to, who to trust, where to go. And I ended up meeting this man with the beige scarf, Hatim Baker. And Hatim owns a garage where food carts are parked. And he also owns several carts that go out and vend. And with him, we created a collaboration in which we transformed this into this and took this off the menu and put that on the menu. So it was a first gesture into saying, here's something that we can do together to help not only beautify public space, but also help impact the health of diets. Now I'm going to leave you with two examples that are slightly more personal. So throughout this presentation, it's a vacillation for me always in terms of work, and I think in terms of food experience as well, is that we go from self to other. Our food behaviors, our food systems affect everything from our politics to our emotions. And something that I'm interested in personally, from a background in dance as well, is that space in between, is how we move between these things. And a recent project that I just did actually this weekend was, oh no, this is not it. This is another one. Hold on. This is a project that comes before it, but is a project that I started with the Museum of Sex 2 years ago, which was starting to look at aphrodisiacs and why we desire certain ingredients. And what came from that is that I started realizing that the role of eating, the actual physical act of eating, was even more important sometimes than looking at something like this or something like this. And so I made a series of images that started to illustrate that these were really things. When you tilt your head back, when you have something dripping on your face, when you have something slightly posed at your lips, or when you actually smash yourself into something. These are all parts of the ingredients of our recipes, and they're ingredients that we don't really consider as much as we do a sauce, a flour, an herb. And that led me to realize that the gestures became movements. And this is Miguel, who's here tonight. And I was approached by the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center up in Troy, New York. They're part of RPI. And they're an amazing, amazing venue. And they are host to a myriad of performers. And most recently, there's a man named Ralph Lemon, who's a modern choreographer, who is up there. And they wanted to make a dinner to accompany his performance, specifically to start talking about what the role of performance is outside of a theater. What are other venues for it that could help offer new forms of distribution for the performing arts? And they wanted to create some sort of a lively, engaging experience afterwards in the form of a dinner. And so we started thinking about it, and something that came up is this notion of gestures, which has both to do with dance and both to do with eating. And this is the first prototype for something that I very simply called the spandex table, in which we took spandex and covered a variety of different forms. And suddenly what happened is that a traditional surface that is flat and that is hard became alive. And so it responded to you as a human and made you sit in different ways, but it also responded to the food. This is spandex pulled over a bowl, right? And so you put a bowl in the bowl, and the bowl starts to dance for you. So in a way, the food became the performer for the dinner. The location, kind of the typology of restaurant changed, just as they were trying to engage the typology of theater changing as well. And this is the result of it. So it was 60 feet of table, it's 180 yards of spandex. And the chairs are covered in spandex, the table is covered in spandex. And the lighting changed from dawn to dusk over the course of the meal. And so the table actually changed shape throughout that as well. You'd start to see different shadows that were cast. And everyone had their own laser cut napkin and name tag, which also started to cast different shadows, symbolically casting different meanings onto this table, different names, different identities. And the food was made by Jose Ramirez Ruiz, a chef here in New York City. Very bold colors that started to create kind of this set for understanding that we were in a new space, that we were in a new interaction, and a new kind of set of experiences that would lead us to eat together. It's amazing. It was less dirty than I thought it would be. Yeah, people were very precious with it. But I have a stop motion of it that we can look at if you want to see later. It's really amazing. And it's interesting to see because in this, where is it? This lighting is when people were most alive, noon, I guess. Most comfortable with high lighting, with clarity, less comfortable in the beginning. It's really fascinating. And all of these things, I make them and I look at them and think, small human experiment. And so I'll leave you with this because these are all going through this work it's a personal exploration. It's a way of being able to look at culture. It's a way of being able to insert myself into culture and hopefully create new culture. But at foundation, more than anything, I think what I would call myself is much more of a narrator. I've had a host of careers and professions, but something that is important to me is to be able to codify all these experiences. And I think creating new narratives, that's all of our jobs, whether we do it through objects, whether we do it through experiences, whether we do it through words. This, to me, is kind of the foreplay that creates our culture. And this is the recent book that I just created, which is called the L.O.V.E FOODBOOK. It's published in French. And I asked 15 different chefs and mixologists around the world to create definitions of love and why love. Early on, when I started with that image of the oyster, I think that's something that always sticks with me, is that there is no such thing as a singular ingredient. And there is no such thing as singular desire. I don't believe that. It is a complex web that we live in. It's a complex web that we create. And these things that we call desire can be a little bit rounder if we start looking at them through love. They can perhaps be a little bit gentler, a little bit more human, a little bit more personal. And my attempt with this book was to codify those stories and to codify that through something that's true to me, very true to my soul, which is in food. And I photographed the book and I designed the book and asked every chef to create a recipe that was comprised of many different ingredients. And each of these ingredients became defined as an emotion in the book. And I'll share with you a few of the narratives that came out of it. And I think the first one is kind of the most poignant. It's a man in Belgium named Kobe de Rasmertz that has a restaurant called Indewolf. And when I asked him what love was, he said, "Oh, it's sacrifice." What do you mean? It's this. So he's cooking now on the farm that he grew up in. And he grew up with 2 pigeons as his pets, and he would feed them and play with them and laugh with them. And one day his mother came to him and she said, "Kobe, we have to kill the pigeons." He said, "Why?" He said, "Because we have to eat." And so he serves today on his menu this dish, which is pigeon that is stuffed with hay. It ferments for 2 weeks, and then he cooks it in hay butter. And it's the moistest, most tender, slightly bitter, delicious thing you've ever tasted. And it transforms into this at the end. And I think it's a very beautiful way to start thinking about love, that something that is about pain, that is about sacrifice, actually becomes something that is so glorious and delicious for another person. Another chef in Chicago, Richard Farina, at Moto Restaurant, said that for him it was about discovery. And this is his vegan dish, which is on a log. So these are little scones that are meant to basically represent slight little sloths. And for him, it became about foraging. That's what love was, and foraging in this minutia of detail, looking, picking through tiny, tiny, tiny things to find the meal. Closer to home is a man named Ignacio Matos, who was the chef at Isa in Brooklyn. And Ignacio is this kind of a person. He's fiery, he's passionate. And his description of love, his contribution, actually had nothing to do with personal relationships. It had everything to do with creating boundaries for his passion. And so these are the ingredients that make this dish. And why does it look like this? This is a tartare, this is steak tartare, and this is flaxseed with rye bread and creme fraiche and juniper berries. It's, if you've ever had it, it's one of the best tartares you've ever had in your life. It's amazing. And visually stunning. And this was interesting when he brought it to me and he said, "This is it, this is love." I said, "Why?" He said, "Why? Because I made rules. I had a staff. I wanted to be able to recreate my passion and share it with everyone. And so I made molds. These things can be made by anyone. They are simple instruments and they are all about creating edges, constraints, and boundaries." And it was a fascinating thing to think about love for him as a process, as a series of constraints that he had created for himself, and to be able to replicate this thing that he truly, truly loved. I then went to Bali to meet with Will Goldfarb, who is an old friend of mine. Will Goldfarb is a pastry chef. He was one of the early molecular gastronomists in New York. And Will is a mad genius. I love him dearly. And he drew this for me. And he said, this is what it is. What is that? Oh, it's this. He has a love of cheese, and he can't eat any in Bali. So some things were these sort of nostalgic, light contributions. He designed a label called Pend and Bear and created a pendant leaf panna cotta that resembled a camembert, only in texture, not in flavor. On the other edge of the coin, and a slightly more powerful one, is a mixologist in Paris, Rob McCarty. He works at David Lynch's club, the Salaciously. And Rob is this tall Irish guy who's super powerful. And he said, for me, it's about suffering. That's all it is. And this is a bloody Yoshi. It's a tomato sake with obviously tomato juice, wasabi, and black sesame seeds. And when you drink it, it is pain and suffering in the most delicious of ways. And so photographing it was a conscious choice. How can I express this? We smashed tomatoes on the bar and had a grand old time, and hopefully David Lynch will never know that I stained his carpet. So one of the last ones that I'll leave you with is this. This is Martine Smith Matheson. So part of this project, which you may have seen some examples of going through this, is that I asked each of the chefs to create a gesture drawing through it. So it's a way of kind of connecting this notion of body and recipe. And this is a drawing by Martine. And these are the ingredients for his cocktail. Martine is half Finnish and half Portuguese. And an unlikely combo that is. And you look at this, and it's one of my favorite images because it's incredibly expressive, and he added sketches to it. And what came out of this was this. It's cachaça, bee pollen, rose petals, shiso, molasses, cassis, aniseed, and a liquor called Bacatavia. And the whole thing is just this total mashup of everything at the same time. You look at it and say, this is never going to taste good. And somehow, within skill and passion and love, he's created something that is a total sensual experience. And I think for me, that comes back to this role that color, that form, that material all play within our eating experiences. This is something that you look at and you salivate even before you eat it. And it leads to that. So I'll leave you with this. As I said, they're all anecdotes of the way that I approach food, that I approach most of my life, which in many ways is a notion or sort of an exploration of this idea of all the acts that will lead to a consumption experience. But I find that this is telling. It's Virginia Woolf from A Room of One's Own. One cannot think well, love well, sleep well if one has not dined well. Thank you.
So we're just going to spend a little time asking some questions from the audience, but I just want to start with one thing, which is it really strikes me in my experience over the past few years that some of the most interesting design is actually happening in these kind of low level or kind of the lower senses like scent or taste or touch. You know, we live in such an ocular-centric culture that's been prioritized for centuries. And I just was wondering whether you had anything to say about this kind of attention that's being paid to things like taste and scent that hadn't been occupying designers in the past.
Yeah, well, I think about this a lot, and I know for me it's always trying to mediate my personal desires for it, but I also know that I'm part of a zeitgeist, and this is something that is happening all around us. And in lots of ways, I think it can be maybe attributed to some backlash from just the technological revolution that we're living through, that you lose as a maker. I mean, all of us who make things, I think, are drawn to the physicality of it. And the more and more, that was something that frustrated me when I left graduate school, was seeing that I was going into the world of the computer. And that was not feeding me in any way. And I think culturally, we're also starting to see this fascination and explosion of food is everywhere. And I think that it is something that humans are looking to just simply be that, is just to be human again. And to say, I want to have these very primary, very fundamental experiences because I'm losing it everywhere else in my life. And that's, I think, the interesting paradox that we're living in right now, is though everything is easier, faster, bigger, better, in lots of ways, just our simple biology is being completely put to the side.
So do we have some questions?
I'd like to ask you a little bit about the gap. I can see the sense of influence from Martha Graham in your standing scale. But you made a huge leap in your life and career from doing very commercial work when you were doing product design to really much more of a fine art sensibility right now. What's in the gap? How did it all happen?
I made that junk food book. That's just it. There actually isn't a space, there's nothing in between those. I just made a decision one day. I got that book project actually came from Alan Chachanoff, who runs the Products of Design program. So he's also the editor-in-chief of Core 77, and I would write for them over the years. And he came to me, they do this back to school special, and this was a hack to work special. And I was working in an agency doing commercial work. And he said, will you contribute something? I said, oh yes, of course, I must do something about food. I've always been a great food lover. And I was totally bored. This is on tape, I'm sorry. But I was totally bored at this job. And I kept making things with the office snacks, like to amuse myself. So and I had this intern who would just laugh and laugh and laugh. And we would play with this. We would basically just play with our food. And when he asked me to contribute something, I came up with this idea of how to hack your vending machine or your office pantry. And so I made a series of 5 different recipes that used things that you could find in your vending machine, i.e. office pantry. And they went up on Core 77. And I went home for Thanksgiving. And I was in the car with my dad, and the phone rang, and it was a publisher. It was Adams Media. They called and said, we saw your junk food recipes online. Have you ever thought of making a book? And I said, oh, absolutely. They said, great. Can you make 100 recipes? No problem. And I hung up the phone terrified. I was like, what? So I got a book agent, and I made 51 recipes instead, thank God. But within 2 months, I quit my job, and I did that. I took the advance, and I went and made that project in about 4 months. I like these epic adventures as well. And then it just, life changed. That's it. It was true. It was, all these projects came to me. There was, and I think that that's something, there is no space in between when it's right. You know, when it is a true reflection of yourself, the world responds to that, I think. And I guess this was right.
No questions.
Are there some moral, ethical limits when designing tools for yourself? Are boundaries you won't go further?
Yeah, I won't eat people. I mean, I think that's not right. Cannibalism is a limit. I do think, you know, and I will say this, and I will admit it, that for me personally, the junk food book is problematic for me, because I don't believe in it as food necessarily. I believe in it as commentary, and it's a place that I'm aware of, you know, and I think that that's something that in our culture, the industrialization of food is something that's highly problematic these days.
Was it presented as commentary?
It was not presented as commentary. It's commentary internally, and then to see what happens in the world. And this is one of those things that is it's a very truthful statement, because sometimes as a designer, you make something with an intent, and the communication around it is not what you intend. And so it is a book, it is funny, you know, those things are delicious and delightful in lots of ways. But at certain moments, as I look at it, I wonder, when I see consumer behaviors with it, you know, is this a line that I want to cross again? I don't think so, no. But that is probably one of those questions that I've posed to myself. I think the other implications of it, some boundaries that I won't cross, I think are just, are more limited, I think, to just personal flavors and tastes. You know, I think that food doesn't really have that many boundaries aside from eating other. It is, as I say, it's a universal material, and to be able to exploit that to the best way possible. You know, it's not about the Twinkie, it is about talking about culture in a lot of ways.
Questions? Going to bring back what happened again, maybe for two. I don't know if that was since you shut down right the first time.
No. No. Yeah, I think there are other projects that we're thinking of developing. It was a huge undertaking. It was really, really challenging. You know, to make a new restaurant every 30 days is just nuts. But yeah, I think now what I'm more interested in are doing more event-based work, like this dinner, where you start to, you free yourself also from commercial confines. You know, one of the struggles with these sort of longer installation projects is that you really are a restaurant. You're trying to mediate between this very commercial space and then this very artistic space at the same time. And in a place like New York City, that's very, very difficult to do. But I would love to do more of these types of things. Yeah.
Has throughout the process which you found, I guess, sort of found food, has the definition of it changed with the way you look at food? Has that changed with the girl?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's more, it's way more complex now than it ever has been. And I think, yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's not, it's so much more than an ingredient for me now. You know, I love to cook. It's one of my favorite pastimes. But it used to actually be about that for me. It used to be about making food. And now it's no longer about making food. It's much more about making emotions. It's much more about making relationships. I start to see it as an entire ecosystem and an entire philosophy too, that implicates so much more, that has resonance, you know, personally and culturally. And I think that's where my relationship has gone with it. And now I think it's also, you know, you've seen this evolution that I use all those words because at moments it has been about ecosystems for me, it has been about traditions, it has been about language, and now I think it's very much for me in body. That's sort of where I am now.
Any questions? I have a few.
I'm really curious, just having come from, my mother's from Sweden, my dad's from Brooklyn, I'm very much a mixed bag as well. How much have you found that your collaborators also come from a mixed background? Like you were talking about the improbable combination of Finnish and Portuguese, which would seem to just kind of collapse in on itself and negate itself. Have you found that people that are drawn to your field, such as it exists, I don't even know if it exists outside of you and a few other people, but have you found that a lot of people who are kind of treading the same territory are in-betweeners culturally like you are?
Yeah, definitely. But I don't even know if it's in-betweeners culturally. I think sometimes it's just in-betweeners. Like it's, the food space is a kitchen, right? And so you're using all sorts of tools, all sorts of inspirations, and then you're running it through your body and you're spitting something out, almost literally, that is something you're gonna put in your body. So to be able to do that, I think, and to do it well and passionately, you have to be able to borrow from many, many, many influences. And I find that with most collaborators, there are people who have a really wonderful way of being able to navigate between their intellect and their heart, you know, or their gut. And I think that's where I find the in-betweeners. And I think that often happens, yes, when you have different cultural experiences, because you start to pose yourself that question and you become very flexible too in definitions. Because it's not, you know, it's always interesting to give presentations on these things using words, because it never exists in words for me. It always exists. Yeah.
Often how you create some kind of experience. We actually had Chandler Burr, who's the New York Times perfume critic, actually do a kind of sampling, a sniffing, as it were, of fragrances when he gave a presentation.
Amazing.
Oh.
Dang. Sorry. I would have made you all Twinko. Can't make you Twinkies anymore.
And also, just maybe if nobody else has another question, I will end with this, which is, how do you describe what you do to people? Since it is such a kind of in-between, undefinable, mercurial thing, I know that for many decades, you know, graphic designers would complain that when their Aunt Zelda asked them what they did for a living, they wouldn't know how to describe it. And I think that's something that designers have said for a long time. That's no longer really a problem, but it might be with you. So how would you define what you do to Aunt Zelda?
Thank God I don't have an Aunt Zelda. You know, I've posed myself that question a lot personally. Recently, I found notes from some article I had read somewhere, and it said that, so design is the arrangement of multiple parts. And I thought about that, and I said, oh, great, so I'm a designer. I'm arranging multiple parts. And that then immediately felt horrible. So I think presently the place that I'm at is that it's, and I said this at the end, it's dimensional narration, I think. Is that I also don't know if it matters what it is that you say that you are. It matters what you do. And it matters how you affect people and how you affect yourself. And something that I am passionate about is being able to create narratives and be able to create experiences and objects and props, whatever you want to call them, that help narrate my life and hopefully engage the lives of others. And so that might be, maybe I've invented a new term for myself, which would be nice, of a dimensional narrator. But it is that space in between. You know, it's art in some places, it's design in other places. But it's more than anything, it's a way of living, you know, and that's something that I never want to let go of. It's so wonderful as a life.
Well, you wear it well. Thank you so much. And again, please join us in the main room for some food, which is going to be a real letdown after watching what, hopefully you'll see Emilie smash things against her mouth, or you would like to do that. So please, thank you for coming, and remember what we have coming up.